All right, thank you for inviting me to speak here. Thank you to NYU. Thank you to Tatiana Linkoeva. Thank you to Sasha Spitalnik. Thank you to Joshua Tucker. Thank you to the Jordan Center. I'm really happy to be here. So as Tatiana mentioned, this talk is about my current book project, which is a history of Buddhism in Russia. The book covers, it's kind of a long survey history, so the book covers kind of a wide, long period starting in the 17th century and ending with more contemporary times. And in particular, I'm going to start today by beginning with how Buddhism came to exist in the Russian Empire, so looking at the 17th to the 19th centuries. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about the oppression of Buddhism in the 1930s. And then I'm going to end with a bit about Buddhism in the post-Soviet period. So I have been very lucky to have spent time in Buryatia, and I was in Kalmykia and Tuva for the first time in 2018. So some of the photographs on the slide are actually recent photographs that I took from that trip. But I think that sometimes when writing a really large survey history, it's a little difficult to think about when to zoom in and when to zoom out. So I'm going to share a little bit with you today about choices that I've made for this book, with paying special attention in particular to the primary sources that led me to be able to tell this story. So first a bit about the Kalmyks, the Buryats, and the Tuvans, so who I am talking about here today. The Buryats and Tuvans live in Siberia, and the Kalmyks reside in southern Russia. The Buryats and the Kalmyks are Mongolian peoples, and the Tuvans are a mix of Turkic, Mongolian, and Siberian peoples, and their language, Tuvan, is a Turkic language. All three peoples originally practiced pastoral nomadism, and their first Buddhist temples were therefore in movable felt yurts. The Kalmyks were originally part of a larger Mongolian ethnic group called the Oirats, and they occupied a territory called Jungaria, which is in today's contemporary Xinjiang province of China. In the 17th century, around 1/4 of these Oirat people moved west, settling on steppe lands along the Volga River and founding a political and territorial unit that came to be called the Kalmak Khanate over here. In 1771, the Kalmak Khanate was dissolved and its lands were incorporated into the Russian Empire. In Siberia, ancestors of the Buryats have likely been there for around 2,000 years, and ancestors of the Tuvans have been there for even longer. The Russian Empire annexed the Buryat lands in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as it conquered Siberia. In the middle of the 18th century, Tuva came to be loosely controlled by Mongolia, which was subservient to Qing China at the time. However, in the 19th century, Russian settlers began to move into Tuva. In 1913, the head Buddhist Lama in Tuva, along with a lay leader, asked Tsar Nicholas II to become a Russian protectorate, and this was granted. Tuva has been a part of Russian lands ever since. So the majority of the Kalmyks, Buryats, and Tuvans currently live in the Russian Federation, each within their own ethnically based territorial republic. There are around 450,000 Buryats today, 300,000 Tuvans, and around 200,000 Kalmyks, all residing in Russia. When, in 1997, the Russian Federation enacted its law on freedom of conscience and religious associations aimed to limit foreign proselytizing, it listed Buddhism as a religion that constitutes an inseparable part of the historical heritage of Russia's peoples. Including Buddhism in this law as a traditional religion of Russia was done with the Kalmyks, the Buryats, and the Tuvans in mind. All three of these peoples originally practiced shamanism, and some still do. However, Buddhism began to seriously compete with shamanism in Inner Asia after the Mongolian leader, Altan Khan, adopted the Gelug school of Buddhism in the mid-1500s. The Gelug school of Buddhism arose in Tibet in the early 1400s under the leadership of a Tibetan Lama named Tsongkhapa. And you can see here Tsongkhapa is depicted in a statue that was erected in Kalmykia in the early 2000s. Tsongkhapa himself synthesized philosophies and ideas from the then existing schools of Buddhism. He called on practitioners to accomplish various stages of study and religious levels that would take a follower to better rebirths, to their own liberation, and then ultimately to Buddhahood, where they would then aid in the liberation of others. In order to carry out this work, he founded the Ganden Monastery in Tibet and developed a structured education system that included understanding and memorizing key texts, carrying out debates, and practicing meditation. This education system would be the very same education system that the Kalmyks, the Tuvans, and the Buryats brought to their own lands when building their own monasteries. In 1578, Altan Khan and the then Tibetan leader of the Glug school of Buddhism, Sonam Gyatso, made an agreement. Sonam Gyatso supported Altan Khan in his leading position among the Mongols in Inner Asia, and Altan Khan promised to bring the Buddhist religion to his people. In addition, Altan Khan gave Sonam Gyatso the title of Dalai Lama, Dalai meaning ocean in Mongolian, and Lama meaning teacher of the faith. Thus, the position of the Dalai Lama was born. Their agreement then led to Tibetan Lamas proselytizing among the Mongols, and this specific set of Buddhism began to widely spread among them. The Kalmyks brought this Gelug sect of Buddhism with them when they left Mongolia to settle along the Volga River around the Caspian Sea. They were therefore Buddhists already when they became part of the Russian Empire in 1771. After the Buryats and Tuvans, Buddhism also came from Mongolia and Tibet, but spread among them at the very same time that Russian power increased in their homelands. In the case of all three of these peoples, it was their political leaders who embraced Buddhism first. Then it was these leaders who connected themselves to high-ranking lamas and supported it and spread it among their peoples, somewhat similarly to the relationship between Altan Khan and Sonam Gyatso. Buddhist lamas helped to legitimize and strengthen the power of lay elites, as well as provided assistance to them in governing. In regards to the Kalmyks and the Buryats, I found that this story is largely told in their chronicles. Between 1690 and the early 20th century, Kalmuk and Buryat chroniclers recorded stories about their own histories, and some of these included information about Buddhism. Written by lamas and lay leaders, most of whom we know very little about, these chronicles relied on oral history and written sources. For many years, Buryat and Kalmak chronicles were held in the libraries of Buddhist monasteries until Soviet anti-religious policies largely destroyed all of those institutions in the 1930s, and many were forever lost. A number of the chronicles then ended up in Soviet archives, where scholars began to study, translate, and publish them. However, I would say most of the attention that has been given to these chronicles in recent past has largely been about translating them. So I therefore began my story on Buddhism by reading through these chronicles to gain a picture of what they might tell us about the history of Buddhism in Russia. What I discovered were a number of origin stories, stories that offer a beginning to how Buddhism came to the Kalmyks and Buryats. These stories provide a kind of shared history, and they name the specific important people involved, a sort of kind of story of the founding fathers of Kalmuk and Buryat Buddhism. In addition, I found stories about leadership, about high-ranking lamas came to positions of power and how they helped lay leaders govern. They also demonstrate an increasing Russian imperial presence. And lastly, these stories also show us the connections between the Kalmyks and Buryats and their co-religionists in Mongolia and Tibet. So I'm going to turn to the Kalmyks first. So there are 4 important Kalmuk chronicles for examining Buddhism in the 17th and 18th centuries. 3 of these have been translated into Russian and 1 into Russian and English, the one on the right over there. The Kalmuk chronicles tell us that just prior to the Oirats, who became Kalmuks, to moving west to the steppes along the Volga River, there was a high-ranking leader among them named Bhaibagas Khan. Bhaibagas Khan, desiring to become enlightened, decided to become a Buddhist. Initially, he wanted to become a monk, but the noble leaders under him begged him not to, worrying that it would lead to political chaos. Instead, they convinced him that it would be better if each leader sent one of his own sons to Tibet to become a Lama. The leaders under Bhaibagas Khan then agreed to do this. Bhaibagas Khan, not having an eligible son at the time, adopted a boy and sent him. This boy was Zaya Pandita. The chronicler Tuvan writes, and this is how Bhaibagas Khan set his followers on the path of good deeds. The Kalmak Chronicles then explain that Zaya Pandita arrived in Tibet in 1617 and studied there for 22 years. In Moonlight, the chronicle about Zaya Pandita's life, the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama asked Zaya Pandita to return to his homeland and preach the faith among his kin. He then traveled widely as a missionary, making several trips to the Kalmak Khanate. For example, he spent the winter of 1655 among the Kalmuks, where, as Moonlight explains, everyone who listened carefully to the holy doctrine sowed the seeds of virtue for the present and future. Well, the Kalmak Chronicles also document how Zaya Pandita decided to adapt the Mongolian script to a more understandable writing system for the Kalmuks. In 1648, Zaya Pandita reformed the Mongolian script into the clear script, which you can see here, which aimed to be closer to the Kalmuk spoken word than the regular Mongolian script. Zaya Pandita and his disciples then spent the rest of his life creating works in the clear script, which was used by the Kalmuks into the 20th century. And the book Moonlight about Zaya Pandita's life was the first original work created in the Kalmuk clear script. Thus, the origin story of Kalmuks and Buddhism places priority on people, Bhaibagas Khan and Zaya Pandita, and on new writing systems and texts. This origin story, while somewhat forgotten during the Soviet period, reemerged in the 1990s, which led to the building of this statue here. In 2019, the city of Elista, the capital city of the Republic of Kalmykia, celebrated 420 years since the birth of Zaya Pandita. The celebrations included a conference about the cultural Buddhist heritage of the Kalmuks, with special attention paid to Kalmuk texts in the clear script. And unfortunately, this is a script that very few people are literate in today. In addition to writing these origin stories, the Kalmak Chronicles also highlight important ways in which the Kalmak Khans of the 17th and 18th centuries relied on Buddhism to help them rule. They sent envoys to Tibet in order to have the Dalai Lama grant them the title of Khan. This helped to legitimize leaders, especially in times of succession struggles. Kalmuk elites also continued the practice of sending sons to Tibet in order to become lamas, following in the footsteps of Bhaibagas Khan. Once trained, these Kalmuk lamas returned and founded movable yurt monasteries that served the needs of Kalmuk parishioners. As the Russian Empire began to increasingly move into Kalmuk lands, Kalmuk Khans used highly educated Kalmuk lamas in their diplomatic negotiations with imperial officials. Lamas spoke to imperial officials during in-person meetings, as well as wrote letters to imperial officials for the Kalmuk Khans. Increasingly, towards the end of the 18th century, we see more and more frustration from the Kalmuk Khans and high-ranking lamas in these diplomatic communications and meetings. The Kalmuk Khans and Buddhist lamas were concerned about Russian Orthodox missionary work. They were concerned about Russian colonization in their lands, and especially the growing inability for them to send envoys to Tibet, because the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty in China began in the mid to late 18th century to more thoroughly control the lands in between them, and thus the various routes from Russia to Tibet, or from Kalmykia to Tibet. And Russia itself began to not allow the Kalmuks to pass through their lands to go to Tibet. These factors contributed in 1771 to the decision by the then Kalmak Khan, Ubashi Khan, made in consultation with leading Kalmuk Buddhist lamas, to move the entire Kalmuk people back to Jungaria, which was then a territory in Qing China. In January 1771, under Ubashi Khan's command, around 150,000 Kalmuks started the long journey to Jungaria through Central Asia, and thus avoiding the Russian Empire. Another 11,000 Kalmuk households, being located on the western side of the Volga River at the time, were unable to cross due to the thinning ice and stayed behind. Believing that the Kalmuks had abandoned Russia, Empress Catherine the Great issued a decree that the Kalmak Khanate and the ruling position of Khan be abolished, and that the remaining Kalmuks and their lands be incorporated into the common Russian imperial legal and territorial system. Thus, the remaining Kalmuks became part of the Russian Empire, and their religion, Buddhism, a permanent fixture in what was no longer the Kalmak Khanate, but the Russian Empire's lower Volga River region. The incorporation into Russia also pushed the Kalmuks to largely give up pastoral nomadism. As more and more Russian settlers came into the region, there was less open grazing lands. And this impacted Buddhism too. Rather than having movable felt yurt Buddhist temples and monasteries, which you can see on the left here, this is what existed in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 19th century, the Kalmyks began to build monasteries out of wood and stone with permanent buildings. By the start of the 20th century, there were 92 permanent Kalmyk Buddhist temples and monasteries in the Russian Empire. The monasteries were modeled on Buddhist monasteries in Tibet and Mongolia with their structured education system. But the one here on the right, the Kalmak Atuski Kurul or monastery built in 1814, was built by Kalmuks who fought in the Napoleonic Wars and wanted to commemorate their experience. In particular, it was funded by a Kalmuk nomad named Serabjab Tuman, who had also fought in the Napoleonic Wars. This Kalmuk had been to St. Petersburg, and he was inspired by the architecture of the Kazan Cathedral. So I think you can kind of see a little bit how this looks a bit like the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. And so he had this Buddhist monastery built with that church in mind. Within a few years of its construction, around 600 Kalmak Lamas came to live, study, and work in this monastery. Thus, these more permanent monasteries became places where Kalmak Lamas could train their own people rather than have to send people to Mongolia or Tibet. I'm going to go ahead and turn to the Buryats. So the next one, please. The Buryats also have chronicles from the 18th to the 20th century. The Buryats produced numerous chronicles, and about 30 still exist today. These have been translated into Russian, and 3 have also been translated into English. The Buryat chronicles were produced in the traditional Mongolian script, and they were written by Buryat Lamas and by noble Buryat leaders. Like the Kalmak chronicles, the Buryat ones also emphasize how Buddhism spread among the Buryats, as well as provide origin stories about early Buddhist lamas. Differently, however, they tell the story of how one lama came to be the head of Buryat Buddhism. In addition, the Buryat chronicles connect important early Buryat lamas to the building of permanent monasteries in specific geographic locations. So just as the Kalmak chronicles have their leaders Bhaibagas Khan and Zaya Pandita, we see 2 Buryat high-ranking lamas emerge in the Buryat chronicles. We see Damba Dorjo Zayaev and Zhimba Akhildayev emerge in the Buryat chronicles. Both were men who came from, were the sons of important Buryat clan leaders who encouraged them to go and study to become lamas in Mongolia and Tibet. So Zayaev, up there on the right, studied in Tibet from 1724 to the early 1730s until, according to the Buryat chronicles, both the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama told him to return home to spread the faith. Reportedly, the Dalai Lama gave Zayaev a drawing of the Samya Monastery, a Buddhist monastery in Tibet, and told him that he should build one just like it back in his homeland. At around the same time, Akhildayev studied in Mongolia as a young man, where one of the Buryat chroniclers explains that the Jepsendama Hutuktu, the head of Mongolian Buddhism, told him to return home and spread the religion. Thus, similar to the case of Zaya Pandita, these founding Buryat Buddhists were told by Buddhist leaders outside of their homelands to return home and spread the faith. When Zayaev and Akhildayev returned to their homelands, however, they were returning to lands that were now definitively part of the Russian Empire. In 1727, China and Russia signed the Treaty of Kyakhta that delineated a border in northern Mongolia between the 2 states. Therefore, the Buryat chronicles in their stories of Buddhism also mention the role of Russian imperial officials. Thus, when Zayaev returned home and helped found the Tsongolsky Monastery, and Akhildayev went on to found the Lake Gusinaya Monastery, which is pictured here, both required permission from Russian imperial officials when constructing permanent buildings made of wood or stone. This too is mentioned in the chronicles. The Buryat chronicles also describe a fierce competition that arose between Zayaev and his Tsongolsky Monastery and Akhildayev and his Lake Gusinaya Monastery over who would be in charge of the Buryat Buddhists. In part, this had to do with the growing power of the Russian Empire in Siberia that sought to have one spiritual leader for the Buryat Buddhists. Eventually, the Russian government settled on this person being the one to hold the title of Pandito Hamba Lama. Pandito comes from the Sanskrit pandit and refers to a person of wisdom, and kambo from the Tibetan henpo, a degree given for higher Buddhist studies. Although Zayayev was the first to hold this title, the contest for power continued after the deaths of Zayayev and Akaldayev. In one of the Buryat Chronicles, written by a Buryat Lama named Buyan Dalai, he tells a colorful story that brought about an end to the competition with a clear win for the Lake Kusinaya Monastery. In the story, a representative from each monastery was sent in a race across Lake Baikal. And from there, whoever reached the imperial administrative offices in Selenginsk first would win the title of the Pandita Kambi Lama for his monastery. The representatives from the Lake Kusinaya Monastery beat his opponent, ensuring that the position would fall to the Lake Kusinaya Monastery alone. Indeed, Lake Kusinaya Monastery went on to be the home of the Pandita Kambi Lamas and the leading monastery for the Buryats from the early 1800s to its closure in 1938. By 1917, there were over 40 Buddhist monasteries and around 15,000 Buryat Lamas in the Russian Empire. We're now to turn to the Tuvans. The Tuvans are a bit different than the Kalmuks and the Buryats. Buddhism came to Tuva much later than it did to Kalmykia and Buryatia. Buddhism had helped the Buryats and Kalmuks establish a culture of writing and had allowed for the production of their chronicles. With the later development of Buddhism in Tuva, this likely contributed to the fact that there are no Tuvan chronicles. There are no sort of Tuvan histories or chronicles in the same way that there are those found in Kalmykia and Buryatia. Therefore, the majority of the early sources that tell us about Buddhism in Tuva actually come from accounts by outside visitors. These visitors, including Victor Popov and Douglas Carruthers up here on the slide, traveled to Tuva in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were all Europeans, including Russians, and they produced a number of accounts in the form of published books and articles. These European visitors went to Tuva for various reasons. Some were passing through on diplomatic missions to China, some were going there to carry out scientific research, and some ended up getting sent near there into exile by Tsarist authorities. However, some of these stories, some of these books and articles do tell us stories about Buddhism in Tuva. In particular, they tell stories about leading lamas, and they tell stories about Tuva's connection to Mongolia. And they also, I think, give us a bit of a picture of what Buddhism was like in Tuvan society. So Tuva itself is quite isolated in the Altai Mountains in south-central Siberia. Nevertheless, it was loosely part of various Mongolian states, beginning from the time of the Mongol Empire to the mid-1700s, when the territory became claimed by Qing China. Yet even then, the Tuvans remained distant and under Mongolian jurisdiction. Chinese authorities did not visit Tuva. Mongolia, which became part of Qing China in 1691, maintained administrative autonomy led by Mongolian nobles and the Jepsendama Hutuktu, the head lama of Mongolian Buddhism. It was these Mongolian leaders who were then tasked by the Qing with overseeing Tuva, which mainly involved tax collection and military conscription. This long-term interaction of the Tuvans with Mongols led to a certain amount of Mongolian influence on Tuvan culture, which by the late 18th century also included Buddhism. So under Qing and Mongolian administration, Tuva was divided into smaller territorial units with Tuvan nobles placed in charge of each one. The leader of all of these units was the Ahmad Nayon, a position founded in 1762. The first three Ahmad Nayons were Mongolian, and the fourth, Ayun Daja, was Tuvan. He was appointed in 1787, and his descendants would serve as the next 9 Ahmad Nayons, creating a Tuvan dynastic line that lasted until the final one's term ended in 1921. It was the Ahmad Nayons who first began to bring Buddhism from Mongolia to Tuva. And pictured here is Kambu Dorja. He was the Tuvan Ahmad Nayon from 1899 to 1619, pictured here in Popov's book. The Ahmad Nayons encouraged Mongolian and Tibetan lamas to proselytize in Tuva and to establish Buddhist monasteries. The first monasteries were introduced at the end of the 18th century, and they were movable felt yurts, like we saw on the previous slide. The leader of Mongolian Buddhism, the Jepsendama Hutuktu, also directly contributed to the process of bringing Buddhism from Mongolia to Tuva. For example, in order to support the Samgalataysky Monastery, which was founded in 1773 in Tuva, he sent Mongolian lamas with Buddhist materials, such as a valuable statue of the deity Mahakala, for which a special temple was built. Given the continual and often close contact between Tuvan and Mongolian Buddhists, many Tuvans deeply revered the Jebsen Damba Hutuktu, even more so than the Dalai Lama in Tibet. Here are some more about the Europeans who visited, and I'm going to cite from some of their writings here. So Victor Poprov here in the middle of this photograph was an officer in the Russian Imperial Army. He organized a scientific expedition to Mongolia in 1903, and he published a book about it in 1904. He wrote in his book about having come across a large caravan of Tuvan pilgrims returning from Mongolia's capital of Urga, where they had gone to go and see the Jebsen Damba Hutuktu. He wrote that these Tuvan pilgrims had journeyed great distances, they had spent quite a bit of money, and they had gone to Mongolia to give offerings to this important Mongolian Buddhist leader. Douglas Carruthers was a British explorer and geographer who carried out an expedition to Tuva and Mongolia in 1910, and later published a 2-volume work about it in 1914. In observing the role of Buddhism among the Tuvans, he noted that Tuvan families often gave one son to the monasteries to become a Lama, and emphasized how the monasteries were the main centers of religious, commercial, and administrative life for the pastoral nomadic Tuvans. He also noted that by 1914, there were permanent Buddhist monasteries in Tuva, made largely of wood, and that these held great importance in Tuvan society. He wrote that the building of temples and monasteries, the only signs of absolutely settled life in the Tuvan world, form a center for administration and trade, as well as for the purpose of religion. The chiefs reside in the neighborhood, Siberian traders pitch their tents nearby, and the bulk of the population congregate here during the winter months. The position of the monastery indicates more or less the headquarters of each tribe. Thus, we can see from his writings how each of the territorial units in Tuva, run by different Tuvan noble leaders, all had their own permanent monasteries, and that these monasteries served in multiple ways and not just in religious ones. So turning to the Minslows, in 1914, Sergei Minslov, a civil servant working in a neighboring Russian region, traveled with his wife Ksenia there to Tuva to observe and write about their experiences. They also had a unique experience of meeting the Tuvan Kambi Lama. So in the 19th century, a hierarchy among the Tuvan Lamas developed, whereby the highest ranking Tuvan Lama was the Kambi Lama. Unlike in Buryatia, where the position of the Pandito Kambi Lama was created in part through a relationship with Russian imperial authorities, the Tuvan Kambi Lama was chosen by Tuvans. However, as in Buryatia, secular elites too contributed to the choice, and the Kambi Lama often came from an important noble family. And Minslov noted some of this in his book. The Kambi Lama oversaw his own monastery, as well as all of the other monasteries in Tuva, having some influence over them, even though each monastery had its own abbot. Minslov visited the Tuvan Kambi Lama when he was there in 1914, and he wrote that the Kambi Lama was very inquisitive and sought to bring education to Tuva. In addition, he held enormous power and influence among the Tuvans, and that even the Russian settlers in the region respected his authority. Carruthers and Minslov also wrote positively about the possibility of Tuva becoming part of the Russian Empire. The issue of Tuva's status in Inner Asia came to a head in October 1911, when a revolution to overthrow the Qing dynasty in China began. Shortly afterwards, on December 1st, Mongolia declared its independence under the leadership of the Jebsen Damba Hutuktu. And this power vacuum left Tuvan elites with having to decide how to respond. While some argued for merging with a newly independent Mongolia, others sought to become a protectorate of the Russian Empire. Those who discussed and decided on Tuva's position were both high-ranking lamas and secular leaders. So Tuvan authorities were high-ranking lamas and secular leaders, and they discussed what to do after the collapse of the Qing dynasty. In the end, however, it was the Kambi Lama Lobsang Chamsa and the Tuvan leader of the Kamchik region, this man here, Buyan Virgi, who successfully contacted Russia. In September 1913, Kambi Lama Lobsang Chamsa sent a letter to Emperor Nicholas II and asked for Tuva to become a Russian protectorate. In the Kambi Lama's letter, he stated that Tuva should be under Russia, writing that with the fall of the Manchu dynasty in China, Russia now has the right to extend its power to this region, and that Tuvan officials, secular and spiritual, ask that we are placed under Russian protection. Buyan Badirgi's letter, sent in October 1913, stressed these sentiments, stating, with the abolition of the Manchu dynasty in China, we, due to our small numbers, still cannot exist independently. Therefore, I and my spiritual and secular officials and the whole people, after a thorough and prolonged discussion of the situation, unanimously decided to ask the great Emperor Nicholas II to accept us under his sovereign hand and patronage. In addition to stressing that both spiritual and secular leaders were involved in this decision, both letters also made other references to Buddhism. The Kambi Lama cited a need for Russian protection to help spread Buddhism. And Buyan Badirgi asked that the Tuvans, for many years, already have professed the Buddhist faith and would like to continue to do so under Russian protection. On April 17, 1914, it was announced that Tuva would become a Russian protectorate. Shortly after, the Ahmad Nayon signed an agreement with Russia. Tuvan then entered the Russian territorial sphere, and the empire gained another Buddhist people. I'm going to start a little bit now, as sort of to talk a bit about all three peoples, and turn a bit to the destruction of, or the oppression of Buddhism in the 1930s. So thus, by the time in 1917 that the Romanov dynasty was overthrown, the Buryats, Kalmyks, and Tuvans were all a part of the Russian Empire, and many of them had converted to Buddhism. There were around 150 monasteries and over 30,000 lamas in Kalmykia, Buryatia, and Tuva. There were also hundreds of other small temples and shrines. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, much of this came to an end. So the oppression of Buddhism in the 1930s was very much part of a larger campaign launched by Joseph Stalin to modernize the country and move it further along the path to communism. For Stalin and his supporters, this involved things like eliminating private property, collectivizing agriculture, rapidly industrializing, but also eradicating certain traditional markers of culture like religion. Soviet authorities came to believe that religion offered an unacceptable distraction to the building of Soviet socialism, and for that reason, religious institutions had to be removed. In Kalmykia, Buryatia, and Tuva, this meant an attack on Buddhism. Over the course of the 1930s, all of the Buddhist monasteries in the Soviet Union were closed. So all of them were closed. Most of the valuable items were destroyed, or in the case of metal statues, melted down for reuse. On occasion, sometimes objects were sent to museums. So for example, in Buryatia, the Zugalaisky Monastery was closed in 1938, and all of its valuable items were sent to the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in Leningrad. All but two of the buildings at Buddhist monasteries, so the one on the right here, the Kalmak Monastery, and the one in the upper left-hand corner, which is in Aga, those are the only two buildings that were not destroyed in the 1930s. All of the other Buddhist buildings were completely destroyed. And you can see here that the Kamakashi Atuski Monastery, if you remember from the previous slide, was more like the Kazan Cathedral with the sort of other side pieces with the columns. So this is reduced to what it is today. So although the buildings remained, they were repurposed and not permitted to serve as Buddhist institutions. Everything in Tuva was closed and largely destroyed. So just one building in Kalmykia and one in Buryatia that really survived. Well, some of the lamas in the monasteries left the monasteries. Some simply just left and joined collective farms or moved to cities to escape. Others were rounded up and sent to gulag camps or executed. In 1938, for example, 1,864 lamas were arrested in Buryatia. Out of this number, 968 were convicted and never heard from again. Most likely they were executed. In Kalmykia, the oppression of Buddhism that began in the 1930s was made final by the deportation of all of the Kalmyks into the interior of the Soviet Union in 1943. When the Kalmyks were permitted to return in 1957, Buddhism had officially disappeared from their lands. In Tuva, which there's no one, I don't have a picture up here. In Tuva, the Bolsheviks established an independent state called the Tuvans People's Republic in 1921. However, it was largely controlled by the Soviet Union. And to demonstrate this Soviet control, one only needs to look at what happened to Buyan Badirgi. Buyan Badirgi was a leader during the 1920s when he and other Tuvan leaders discussed making Buddhism the state religion. He and those leaders were removed and later killed. They were replaced by Tuvan communists loyal to the Soviet Union. Then in the 1930s, when anti-religious campaigns worked to wipe out Buddhism in Kalmykia and Buryatia, they were enacted in the very same way in Tuva. In 1944, the Tuvan People's Republic was dissolved and Tuva was annexed completely into the Soviet Union as an autonomous territory. However, during World War II, Stalin relaxed Soviet policies towards religion. This leniency set into motion the construction and opening of a brand new monastery in 1946 in Buryatia, and this is the one here, the Ivolginsky Monastery, Ivolga. Shortly afterward, the remaining building here, the one at Aga, was also permitted to reopen. But no Buddhist institutions were allowed to reopen in Tuva or Kalmykia, only in Buryatia. So therefore, this Ivolginsky Monastery in Buryatia became the center of Buddhism in the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. However, the state did carefully monitor the monastery and restricted the number of lamas who could live there. In addition, in 1946, Soviet authorities created the Central Spiritual Buddhist Authority to formally oversee all Buddhist activities. The head of this organization was then appointed to be the new Pandito Kambi Lama, and no heads of Buddhism were permitted to exist in Kalmykia or Tuva. In the Soviet Union, a resurgence of Buddhism has occurred in Tuva, Kalmykia, and Buryatia. And I think the focus of the resurgence has been on some of the very same topics that I've shared here today. So building permanent temples and monasteries, selecting important Buddhist leaders, and working with lay leaders to strengthen Buddhism in society. So I'm going to just briefly share a couple of examples here, looking at Tuva, Kalmykia, and Buryatia before I finish up here today. So a couple of examples. So in Tuva, the first place the Buddhists began to gather in the 1990s was this temple here, Ustuhure. So this temple was built originally in 1905. It was actually built by the father of Kambi Lama, Lobsang Chamsa, and Buyan Badirgi, the two people who had written to Tsar Nicholas II to become a Russian protectorate. It was their father who built this temple in 1905. In 1930, the monastery was closed, and in 1937, officials sought to destroy it, but they never actually destroyed it completely, and the walls you can still see there. There was a discussion at some point after the collapse of the Soviet Union to rebuild a new temple right on top of the ruins of this one here, but they decided instead to build a new one over here. But people come and they worship at the walls of this older temple, which you can see here. In 1997, the Kambi Lama, the title and the position was resurrected. So once again, there is one person who is the official head of Buddhism in Tuva. In Kalmykia, where all the Buddhist temples had been destroyed except that one that I showed you, there has been a huge resurgence of Buddhism, and in particular, a great deal of attention paid to building brand new Buddhist monasteries and temples. So in addition, so you can see here a couple of the new ones that have been built in the 2000s, and this one here on the left is enormous. It's quite stunning. In addition, the Buryats who have their Pandito Kambi Lama and the Tuvans have their Kambi Lama, came to this desire in the 1990s that there should be a Kalmuk leader for the resurgence of Buddhism, someone to really help the Kalmuks become Buddhist again. So the push for this actually came from the 14th Dalai Lama, who visited Kalmykia, Buryatia, and Tuva in 1992. The Dalai Lama chose Erdnei Ambadyakov, a Kalmuk Lama who was born in Philadelphia, where I live. Ambadyakov was given the title of Shajin Lama, or Supreme Lama. At the time, he was only 22 years old, and he spoke no Kalmuk or Russian, I believe, very little Russian. Nevertheless, he has eventually taken on this task, and he's overseen a really great resurgence of Buddhism in Kalmykia. I'm going to end in Buryatia here. In Buryatia, the position of the Pandito Kambi Lama has continued. The current one is Damba Ayushev, who's pictured here with Vladimir Putin. And I'm using this slide to stress again that Buddhism and Buddhist leaders in Russia have continued to have very strong relationships with lay leaders. And so, of course, having a relationship with Putin is very important to maintaining a resurgence of Buddhism and a strengthening of Buddhism in society. So I will leave us there and say thank you. And maybe we can turn to questions.
Thank you so much. I think I have so many questions, but I will turn first to the people who are in the room. If you have questions,
So you mentioned that in the 30s, in 1930s, all the monasteries were destroyed and Buddhists were sent to Buryatia and killed. Have any of them actually survived? Were there any like underground worshippers between 1930s and say like 1980s?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. So I think that the sort of official, destruction of Buddhism meant eliminating all of those buildings and rounding up all of those materials and melting them down or putting them in museums. But absolutely, people did continue to worship in their homes. But, depending on what time period it was in the Soviet Union, that could get someone in big trouble. The KGB monitored very closely, particularly at the Bhaibagas Monastery, who came to celebrations, how many people came, and maybe even writing down, and what their names were, right? And that could maybe cost you a job, or it could cause you trouble later, down the line. So people did continue to, of course, worship and believe. There were a lot of people who understood, I guess, a lot of lamas, especially younger ones in the early 1930s or even in the late 1920s, who saw the writing on the wall and they left. So maybe they just went and joined a collective farm and just lived their life in the Soviet Union as a collective farm worker, or they moved to a city and started working in a factory. So there were people, like I've met a number of people who've told me, oh, my great-grandfather was a lama, but he left before the Tuvan was closed or the monastery was closed. And he just, sort of folded back into Soviet society and never told anyone what he had done previously.
Thank you. So to remind, you can post your question in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and introduce yourself and ask a question. All right, so I will go to the chat question. It's from Marjorie Balster. Thank you for the talk. And the question is whether you have seen some other data about alternative histories of when Tuvan came into the formal Russian sphere. But I guess it's about this letter that they asked
right.
for the Tsarist government for the protectorate. So because consider that the 1914 protectorate narrative is the official one, and that Tuva revisionist histories spread that Tuva had its own state in the 1920s and 30s, partly to help preserve Buddhism versus common separation. I guess there are two questions in one. Is there other alternative history of the protectorate narrative, and whether Tuva had an independent state in the 20s and 30s?
I mean, sure, absolutely, right? I had a very short amount of time, and for me, I was really stressing the connections to Buddhism. So I was very impressed that these letters came from the Kambi Lama, of which I could find no pictures of him. I just have Buryatia, who's been more celebrated, and I think is more the official narrative. But those letters both refer to Buddhism, which I found really interesting. And for me, that was I was kind of emphasizing here in this talk today. But absolutely, I mean, you could go all the way back. One of the things that both Tuvans and Russians look to is back to the 1600s, when what the Russians call the Altan Khans made agreements with Russian imperial officials that some Tuvans look to, or some Russians later look to, or Soviet officials later look to as the very first linking of Tuva to Russian space. I would say in terms of its independence, certainly it behaved, it had a certain degree of independence, but at the same time, it was impossible not to have some interference from the Soviet Union, which was an enormous neighbor to its north, and there was not much to stop it, I think.
I actually have my own question about that.
Yeah.
So you said that Mongolia is trying to, after the collapse of the Qing Empire, trying to become independent, and Tuva had these two choices, and then they chose Russia. So why didn't they go with Mongolia?
So that's a good question. So there were a lot of Tuvan nobles that wanted to go with Mongolia. And actually the Ahmad Nayon at the time, he first wrote to Russia. He wrote to Russia before Buyambadirgi and the Kambi Lama, but he never got an answer. So then he was convinced by other Tuvan noble leaders to go with Mongolia. The problem with Mongolia is that we see that, at least in Buyambadirgi's letter, he says that the Mongols are overtaxing them and that some Mongols are coming in and beating up Tuvans and that they're stealing their cattle. But I think it was a controversy. I mean, I think there was a real division. No one said, let's join China, though. That didn't seem to be one of the options.
I can hardly imagine that. All right, so a question from Erika Eisen. Thank you for the talk. What kind of support has the Russian state given to the Buddhist community in recent years?
That's
a big question.
A big question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, I think just how I cited the 1997 law from the very beginning, that there's this desire to say that there are traditional religions of Russia and that Buddhism is one of them. I think if you look at Buryatia, that there have been some different sects of Buddhism that have been coming into Buryatia, and that has caused some desire to maybe get Russian state support for the one sect with Yushev as the head of the Buddhist church in Russia.
Okay, so now we'll take a direct question.
Right, and next, we can just a little bit closer to the speaker for, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so who should?
This is Griffin's speech.
Okay.
I know.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for doing this talk. It's really interesting to hear, and I think especially interesting to hear the three cases of Buryatia, Tuva, and Kalmykia put side by side. I learned a lot from that. So I have a question about Russian imperial authorities' kind of early reactions to Buddhism in any or all of these regions. So I'm thinking about, there seems to be some kind of larger picture similarities with Islam, in that, the process you described of Buddhism coming into the Russian Empire is one that's, inherently dependent on foreign ties to Mongolia and Tibet, especially. I'm thinking about Robert Cruz's argument here that, how the Russian state is very suspicious of Islam because of its ties to the Ottomans, but also its attempt to mediate into Islamic communities and to establish some type of Islamic orthodoxy that it can then build a state through. But there also seems to there's a difference obviously with Buddhism in that the state's familiarity with it would be much lower because Islam is a much sort of more familiar religion to Russian imperial authorities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about their early reactions to these foreign ties, and is there an effort to establish like a Buddhist orthodoxy and to govern through that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I would say that maybe I'll just use Buryatia as an example. So in 1727, when the Treaty of Kyakhta was signed between Russia and China and a border was delineated, there was a count, a man named Raguzinsky, who was working for the Russian Empire, and he stayed in Buryatia and along that border there for a few years trying to sort of figure out the border. And he became convinced that there was too much moving back and forth across the border, and a lot of it were Lamas that were going back and forth. But he discovered, and he argued anyway, that those Lamas were also carrying out commercial activities, and that also had to be restricted. So there was this kind of desire. He made the argument that there needs to be one Buryat Buddhist leader, and actually he picked a Tibetan to be the first one. But that way those Lamas wouldn't have to go back and forth. And in a sense, he actually encouraged the Buryats to build Buddhist temples and monasteries so they could train their own people and they wouldn't have to send them to the other side. But I think what's interesting too is that he was also very concerned about, he wrote a lot about the commercial activity, that these Lamas are also, have this commercial activity of going back and forth and they're making money and doing other things on the side, and he wanted to stop that. So I think absolutely there's, all the way back from the 1700s, there's been a desire for that. And then if we go to Kalmykia, and I mentioned that for the Kalmak Khans, the way to legitimize their status and their title Khan was to go to the Dalai Lama or to send an envoy to the Dalai Lama and get that title approved as Khan. And both Russia and Qing China became increasingly concerned about those envoys, and they weren't sure what they were doing. And maybe there was some secret diplomacy that was happening at the same time, or maybe they too are carrying out commercial activities. That was a problem too. And so there was a desire to kind of stop that. And let's let the Kalmuks build their own institutions in Kalmykia and stop this, cross-border travel.
So I put my question in the chat, but I'd add a little bit to it. I'm interested in the way that the relation of Buddhism in the early stages in these three areas shaped the Buddhist ideas themselves, with the relation with political authorities. That is, I mean, at least that we know that there's at least some leader who is appointed by the state, or at least is pushed into that position. And that must have had some effect on the kind of Buddhism that emerged there. And conversely, Buddhism is obviously being used to reinforce political authority. How does that happen? What are the concrete steps in which it is reinforced? And, obviously during the Stalinist era, it's not being used to reinforce, except possibly after World War II, when it's allowed, it might have had a particular meaning in reinforcing political authority. But when Putin starts to meet with those leaders, obviously his interest is that that leadership will reinforce. So if you could say something about these two sides, how the relation to political authority shaped Buddhism in those areas, and how political authority used Buddhism to reinforce its
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So, I guess I could poke myself into a number of different places in history. I mean, you could go all the way back. There's kind of a Mongolian tradition called the two customs, whereby there became a kind of an ideal hundreds and hundreds of years ago that there would be a Mongol Khan or a Mongol leader, and there would also be a Buddhist leader, and that somehow they would lead together, and this would be the two customs or the two laws. And so I think there was an ideal, perhaps even in Mongolian traditions. But then there also is this, desire. And so we see that play out in different ways, right? I would say that in Buryatia, the Pandita Kambi Lama develops really in conjunction with Russian officials, pretty much from the very beginning. Nevertheless, there are still noble Buryat leaders who are involved in those decision-making processes. In Tuva, which of course is not a Russian space, but is only loosely controlled by Mongolia and China, that develops a little bit more on its own. And then in Kalmykia, it's interesting because we see in the 1990s that the push for a Kalmuk leader actually comes from the Dalai Lama, that there needs to be someone in Kalmykia to be this leader. So I think there could be many different forces that actually produce these leaders. And sometimes it is the Russian imperial officials, but I think it's interesting to constantly see this kind of connection between lay leaders and Buddhist leaders.
Just to be a little more specific, is there any way that this connection shaped some of the Buddhist ideas in those regions? I mean, historically, that's been true in Buddhism from ancient times on in both India and China, but I don't know to what extent that's true in Russia.
So for example, in 1640, there was a law code that was written by Mongols that involved some Buryats, some Kalmuks came for this law code writing, and the law code was mostly intended to stop the Mongols from fighting one another, but it was also intended to really set up this kind of two customs where you would have lay leaders and you would have Buddhist leaders. It was also intended to stamp out shamanism. And while the Buryats and the Khalk and other Mongols didn't follow this so much, the Kalmuks continued to use that law code. And in 1740, they rewrote the law code. They also rewrote it in the 1820s, and they used that all the way up until the Soviet Union. So I think, does that maybe answer a little bit that there are these moments that I think from the lay leadership perspective that come in and help to perhaps institutionalize Buddhism, support Buddhism, and then maybe shape it in very particular and specific ways. And part of that could be, I think, particularly for the Kalmuks, really stamping out shamanism. So whereas there's a great deal of shamanism in Tuva and Buryatia today, there really isn't in Kalmykia.
And on the other side, how is Buddhism being used at various periods to reinforce state power or imperial power?
Well, I think that gets into, from the state's perspective, right? So if we take Empress Catherine the Great, she's looking at Russian Orthodoxy, and Russian Orthodoxy has a patriarch and there's one leader. And so for her own diplomatic purposes or official purposes, she has one person to deal with. So I think there's this kind of desire to impose that upon other religions, that if you have one Buryat leader of Buryat Buddhism, that's one person to communicate with as a state official, to pass down policies, to collect censuses, how many lamas are there, how many aren't going to have to pay taxes, those kinds of things. If that answers it somewhat.
I think Nikolai Cherempilov, he wrote recently a book about the Russian Emperor.
Yes. Yeah. So Cherempilov's work, Russian Empire and Buddhism, is a great example of that. He really delves into those sources.
All right. So I will pick one. I think it's related. A question from the chat box. The question by Ksenia Sidorova. So she's curious about Stalin's reversal of religious policy during the war. Why did he allow Buddhism again? And what are the reasons?
So I would say his reversal of policies in general was a relaxing of religion. And that was really because of the feeling that all effort had to go to the war. And so if some people needed to be religious in order to be able to throw themselves at the front, to stop the Nazi invasion, then that was even okay. So there was a certain amount of Russian Orthodox priests who were allowed to go to the front and bless the troops. And so I think that's what set into motion this idea of being allowed to open another Buddhist monastery. But it's interesting because it's not opened until 1946, actually, when the war is over. And then I think the idea is to be using it in part from the state perspective, to use it for propaganda purposes. Look, we still have a working Buddhist monastery in the Soviet Union. And then even say in the 1960s, when there are these kind of international Buddhist peace conferences around the world, the Soviet Union has someone to send as its representative. We have someone in Buryatia, Pandita Kambi Lama, or another representative who can serve as, look, we have real living Buddhists and practicing Buddhists here in the Soviet Union.
But I was curious why Buryatia was chosen.
That's a good, well, I guess Kalmykia, they're deported. So they're not even in Kalmykia, and probably Tuva. Tuva also had been this autonomous region, or well, it was technically independent until 1944. So Buryatia becomes that. And I would say, even to get back to one of the other questions, like Buryatia has this Pandita Kambi Lama that had been in place since the 1700s. So there's already been, I think, a stronger tradition of having leadership in Buryatia that the Russian Empire relied on. Yeah.
Okay. There was a question, but no. So question from the chat. Could you speak about the history of the Buddhist Datsan in St. Petersburg and the Buddhist presence at the Russian court?
That's a great question. I really can't say a whole lot about that. That's not something I've studied an enormous amount, but Ogban Dorjiev was obviously instrumental in that. So there's Buryat Buddhists there. There were Buryat Buddhists. There was a Buryat Buddhist at Tsar Nicholas II's court. I think that, again, this shows this stronger and longer relationship with Buryat and Buryat Buddhism to the Russian imperial authorities. That's probably all I could say about it, but.
So yeah, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, so a question from James Lindo. Have you encountered any references to non-Gelug Lamas or practices? I have seen a few scattered references to the Nyingma school in Tuvan, for instance.
Yeah, so there definitely are. And I think it's a really interesting one because you think about, if you look at that, again, that 1997 law in Russia is in some sense to try to stop foreign proselytizing. So are other sects of Buddhism maybe coming from outside of Russia? Is that some kind of foreign proselytizing? And I think there is some issues with that. And I would say Ayushev is trying to protect the Gelug school of Buddhism. So while there are other sects, there are other schools, I'm not sure that they're supported very well. I don't know if you can, maybe if you have anything to say. If you've seen some of that already.
I have no idea, but I know like again, someone asked a question about Islam in Russia, right? There's also the schools to have only one school of Islam
Yeah,
and not allow other schools of Islam.
Right.
And the same with Buddhism, like one school of Buddhism that is proven to be loyal.
right, yes.
Okay. So question, what is the comparative status of ongoing revival of Buddhism in the three regions? Based on institutional rebuilding, share of lay Buddhists, education of monks, and other criteria.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think when you visit those three regions, I think you're very struck by the resurgence. It's just, there are brand new Buddhist temples, there are people practicing Buddhism. It's definitely really, really striking. I think the one thing that surprised, or maybe not surprised, but I found to be impressive or to be notable is that in Buryatia and Tuva, there's also a very strong resurgence of shamanism, and that presence is very visible also. There are now shamanism, which used to be a religion that was connected to natural spaces, a forest or a rocks or a mountain. Now there are actual physical shaman, buildings and institutions that you can visit in Ulan-Ude or in Kizil. That doesn't exist in Kalmykia. Kalmykia really seems to me to be much about Buddhism, but there's not a lot of shamanism. And I think partly that goes back to those law codes, which the Kalmyks followed much more thoroughly. And used again all the way up into the 20th century. And those law codes, shamans could be punished. Shamans had to pay fines. They really sort of tried to stamp out shamanism in a way that, and perhaps too, I think to say, and we were talking about this earlier, just at how separate these three regions are. And so in part, there's a great distances between them. Like this is an enormous amount of space between them. And Tuva in particular is in kind of an isolated spot in the mountains. But I would say that there also, the Soviet Union had a desire to not allow for there to be links between these three spaces. So it would be interesting to see if there could be more connections, or that will develop more over time. I don't know.
And so the Buryat Kambi Lama, he cannot oversee what's going on in Tuva.
No, he's not overseeing what's going on in Tuva and Kalmykia, because they each now have their own leaders. So they're the Shanjan Lama in Kalmykia and then the Kambi Lama in Tuva. So they have their each own leaders. Yeah.
All right. Okay. No question. Yeah, okay. A post-Soviet question. In the 1990s, I heard about Russians going to study Buddhism in Buryatia. What did Buryats think of that? Treating, like what they think about this outsiders coming and treating Buddhism as a kind of new age phenomenon. And are there still significant numbers of Russians showing up to study?
I think in terms of Buryatia, I think that's happened all the way since the 19th century. Just talking about Tsar Nicholas II having a Buryat at his court, having a temple in St. Petersburg. In the 1970s, there was the Bandaran affair, which was very famous, that Bandaran affair, that a Buryat Lama was practicing Buddhism, and he invited people to come from across the Soviet Union to do this with him. And there were some Estonians and others who went, and then he was eventually arrested and died in a labor camp. So there have been moments where these Europeans, if you will, have already been coming in trying to practice Buddhism. Absolutely, in Buryatia, you can meet Russian or ethnically European-looking lamas. And Kalmykia also, I saw that. I did not see any of that in Tuva. And again, I think maybe Tuva being a little bit more isolated. But I would say too that, and I think we were talking about this a little bit today too, that many people also go to India to study with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans who are there in the Tibetan community there. And they come from all over the world. So I think there's also a long tradition of others perhaps participating in this.
Yeah, I definitely saw some of, Russians in Buryatia.
Yeah.
In Lama clothes and most of it. But I'm usually.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Okay, someone made the correction that Catherine II didn't have a patriarch, but a holy synod. Yes, a holy synod,
but still, nevertheless, some kind of, an official center, or an official sort of place that one can go to as an emperor, as a lay leader, to have an official space to talk to for the church or the Buddhist congregation or whoever it might be. I guess. Yes, you're right. That's a good correction.
Okay, so in line with the topic of revival, what is the state of the surviving Buddhist text? Tibetan and Mongolian language manuscripts and block prints from the pre-Soviet period in these regions today. Are there efforts to collect, digitize, or restore them?
That's an excellent question. I mean, there definitely is in Buryatia. There is a, there's a Mongolian and Tibetan institute that is dedicated to that, and I can't answer that any better than someone in Buryatia could tell me much more about that. I don't really know, but I definitely know that there are places for that. In Kalmykia also, and I mentioned the anniversary of Zaya Pandita's birth was a moment to try to once again talk about those manuscripts. I think the challenge, of course, is finding people who can read the clear script, people who can read the traditional Mongolian script. There are people who are being trained, training doing that, but that's very difficult. I know that for Kalmuks, a lot of Kalmuks immigrated to the United States, for example, and there are some collections of their works that are here that are people are working with, but even that is challenging, I would say.
I guess it also depends on the state support, right?
Yeah.
Is there a state support like that? So doing that.
That's right. Yeah, there has to be money for that. That's a good point. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was curious about how Damba Ayshev developed his relationship to Putin. Ayshev accompanied Vladimir Putin to Chechnya on December 31st, 1999. Do you know how he managed to be so efficient?
That I don't know. That's really interesting. I didn't know he had gone to Chechnya. That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure, but I think anyone who's anyone in Russia at the moment and wants to protect perhaps their religious congregation, it's not bad to have Putin on your side. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't honestly know the answer to that.
I met him once. He's a very powerful.
Yeah.
Has a very powerful personality. Yeah, but I didn't know that Chechnya.
I didn't know that either. That's really interesting.
All right. So, someone is commenting on the previous question about the revival of the text. There are efforts to restore those texts in some Vatsans. Rituals are read in traditional Mongolian and Tibetan texts have been translated to Burya.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so another question. There was a grant, sorry, it's not a question. There was a grant-funded project in Buryatia to recover manuscripts and to preserve manuscripts. Yeah, it was funded out by England.
Yeah, I was going to say there might even be people on this Zoom right now who could answer some of those questions better than me. But there definitely are efforts for preserving this, but like you said, it's costly.
Yeah.
And you have to have the people who can read the languages. That's tough.
All right. So, any questions from the audience, from the Zoom audience? Please raise your hand. No, this is just a link. And the remaining. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, there is another. Sorry. Were the remains of executed Buryat Lamas ever found?
The ones that I mentioned, no. Not that particular moment, no.
Okay.
Sadly.
Okay. So
I have one more question. So in the 60s, in the Soviet Union, a lot of books on Eastern religion were published by scholars of Orientalism. Were there any texts that you mentioned published at the time? Translated into Russian.
Yeah, so the Chronicles, you mean, or yeah, a lot of the Chronicles were translated in even the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 30s, even some of them. But I think that the Chronicles say a lot more. So I kind of mined the Chronicles for stories of Buddhism that fit what I wanted to explore. But there's a lot more stories in there. So the Kalmak Chronicles have a whole lot of stories about the Khans and the successions of the different Khans. The Buryat Chronicles have a lot of stories about families and heritage and whose clan was doing this and which clan and people getting, those sorts of kinds of stories. So genealogical stories. So I think in some sense, religion for so long was seen as, the official policy was atheism. So if you're publishing something about religion, you're always going to have to condemn it in a way. I think a lot of the publications in the Soviet Union, or you're not going to say use the Buryat Chronicles to tell that piece of the story. So if you want to use the Buryat Chronicles or the Kalmak Chronicles, you want to use the Kalmak Chronicles to tell the history of the Kalmak Khanate, that's fine. But don't, the Buddhist side of the story is left out largely. But yeah, I think there was a great deal of, there's a whole Institute of Oriental Studies, that, and there are many institutes in the Soviet Union that studied Buddhism, but again, studied it from a particular perspective.
I have a question about the Kalmyks. The story that when they decided to leave in the 1700s, they have some left and some stayed, and then the Khanate was dissolved. So why did the Russian government, or Catherine II, did it occur to them to convert those Kalmyks?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's really an interesting one too, is that Russian missionary works, there were Russian missionaries, very few in Buryatia. There were some, but there was always kind of, I think, the Yasak pairs. They paid their Yasak. You don't necessarily want to convert them to Russian Orthodoxy. But Kalmykia, there were much stronger efforts at Russian Orthodoxy. And there was, some people say that by 1800, 10% of the Kalmyks are practicing Russian Orthodoxy. But I think it's always a little hard to tell. I would say that wait, back to the
it's about Kalmyk, right? Was it the state not that eager to convert?
Oh, right, yeah.
This, they didn't need to do it as it was in the late 19th.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in the 1700s it wasn't so organized. There was an effort, but also the Kalmyk lands were much more strongly the Kalmyk lands, and Kalmykia saw itself, it was an independent entity that had, relations with Russia. So then it's, these Russian settlers are kind of moving in. Some of them are bringing Russian Orthodoxy with them. Some of them, might be a couple of missionaries. And so there was an effort, but not really. Once, the Khanate is dissolved and those become Russian lands completely, then it's a lot easier. And there's more of an effort at Russia at missionary work.
It's a fascinating case for me because they're in the middle of Russia, basically, and they still managed to preserve a very strong tradition of Buddhism.
Yeah, and actually and it's interesting because a lot of the settlers who moved there were fewer ethnic Russians. There were Germans who moved there. So Catherine the Great had invited Germans to come and move there. She had invited Serbs to come and move there. So there are other people that were living there. The Germans of Kalmykia have largely left, though, which I think maybe again makes it even more Buddhist in a sense, because some of those people have left, but the Kalmyks have stayed behind.
Yeah. All right. So I guess we have no more questions from the Zoom audience. No. Okay. One more in chat, and I guess we will finish. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful
Thank
talk.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you to everyone who came on Zoom. Thank you to the audience here. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.